they were folks that were in my last session. So we're gonna do a similar experience in this one. We are probably collectively feeling some range of tired, sleepy, maybe we ate a lot of lunch, maybe we didn't, so we might be hungry or overly full. So to kick us off, I'm going to do a series of stand-ups. So just identification by size of co-op, fun stuff like that, just to kind of get us all awake and alert and seeing who's around us. And maybe you've been in sessions with a lot of other folks, but this way we get a sense of who's in the room. It gives me a sense of kind of maybe how I can direct the conversation over the next hour as well. And then I'm going to have a little conversation about my work experience and what brought me to my current position and how we managed that process over the last year and a half. And then we'll dive into a few topics that I listed as kind of general speaking points, but I'd really like this to be an interactive session and not just me talking at you the whole time. So I'd really love to have conversation, questions, interaction. And as you will find out, I have not a word on any slide. I have pictures. Because this isn't a content-heavy session. I really want this to be an interactive space. And I am speaking from personal experience. That's why I was asked to speak. I'm not speaking because I'm a train-the-trainer for hiring a GM, right? I'm speaking from my experience and my work background. And happy to lend what I know and keeping it framed in that it's my perspective. I'm not representing a collective of GMs and how every GM would ever want a space to be prepared. So let's do a few stand-ups. So first I'd like to see who is with a organization supporting co-ops. Great. And then let's do anyone representing an open co-op. Your doors are open, you're making sales. Excellent. Feel free to join in, find a seat. My chair's way over. I think you can see over through the side there. I think we can All right, so who here is in like their first year of organizing? Just getting together. All right, there we go. We have someone here, 2 people, great. And then who's in that, like 2 to 5, you're working on capital, you're working on owner growth to get open. All right, awesome. And then who is like ready to open? And you're ready to hire a GM. Or you're a GM and you're getting ready to open. So stand up 2 people.
I'm going to get water while you're talking.
Sounds good. And who is actively seeking a GM right now? All right, a couple of folks. All right, so it's good for me to see, right, that we have a fairly evenly divided room spread across these different kind of sections of work and different places. And if you're at my last session, then it's the same thing. It's thinking about, depending on where you are in your phases of work, none of this is impossible, but the closer you are to hiring and opening, the harder it can be to change some of the stuff you've already done, right? Because you may have already thought you knew or had somebody tell you that you knew and you're really close, and then maybe I'm going to say something that you're going to be like, oh my God, how do we change that? And it's possible to do this. It's possible to work through things that might be considered last-minute adjustments, but it's always good to keep reflecting on what we're doing, how we're doing it, and how we can do it better. Having a change-oriented mindset as we do this work. So my story, so I'm Sam McCormick. I'm currently the general manager at Aspect Co-op Market, which is a startup that is about to break ground this summer to build our store. And my pronouns are they and them. And my experience is weird and varied and not within one industry. And depending on where I've worked, that's really rattled people, right? They're like, but what's the tie? How does this all connect? And so my background and work has been either very hands-on, so I've worked in construction, I've worked in landscaping, I've worked as a baker, I've worked as a candlestick maker, whatever. You know, like it's kind of what I am. And then from when I was fairly young, I was either shoved into or fell into positions of leadership without any training. People were like, you are really chill. I think you can corral people. Here you go. Here's the food, right? So my first real experience with that was I was in college. I was working as a baker at night. And I was switching degrees because I really hated the degree I was doing. So I switched it at the last minute. I was getting my associate's degree to transition to bachelor's. So I finished out the associates working as a baker, got involved in theater work, and had that fun phrase said, "Oh, you're really good behind the scenes." And I was like, no, not stage. That would happen anyways in leadership work. But I became the stage manager. I managed back of house as the assistant director. And I still to this day hold that if I get 35 volunteer college students to show up to rehearsal, I can do anything. I think it's still true. And kind of from there, you know, I managed a bookstore. I was with Mariposa Food Co-op in West Philly, and I was the director of ops for a construction company. And again, like, what are the through lines? And for me, it was that throughout these different jobs and the different spaces, I found the commonalities, right? Business management is not different in a co-op than it is in a construction company. What you sell is different, your margins are different, your sales goals are different, your product is different. How you run the company shouldn't be that different, right? You still have stakeholders, you still have somebody that wants you to have a profitable bottom line, you still have, right? And the place I'm in now is not the place I was at in that college theater, because over the years, there's been a lot of intention that's gone into this work, right? I didn't know about food co-op management until I was the manager of a food co-op. I don't recommend that, it's a trial by fire experience, but I walked into the work at Mariposa having retail experience and retail management experience. And I had worked with food. And I worked with people. I had not run a food co-op, I had not run a grocery store, right? And coming into Mariposa in a space that was so rich with people coming in, and we had the opportunity to fail in a particular way that we don't often get as a startup, right? I came into Mariposa within the first 6 months of its doors being open to the public, and at that point it had a diversified general management structure. That every one of us that was a department head was also the general manager. And that is a model of doing things. And I mean, like I said that kindly, there are some folks who want to do that work. And it is great work. It is a lot of work. And one of the things that my experience was that every time a department head left, we lost part of our general manager, right? And there were a few of us that were always like, all right, I'll catch that piece. I'll catch that piece, right? And throughout that, there was thankfully the opportunity to do a lot of leadership training and development work. Worked with folks from Cluminate, at that point it was CDS, folks from NCG, and it was really the learning how the wheel worked while we were building the wheel and reshaping the wheel. You know, it was a lot at once. But again, it was within a community of folks that there was a lot of trust. We were able to kind of be really open about where we were at, what we were learning, and how we were doing. And then in 2015, I moved on from Mariposa and went to work within a green construction company. I was director of ops, a construction company. And when I left Mariposa, we all have times when we're in a kind of chaos experience where we go, what in the hell am I going to learn? What am I going to get out of this, right? And it was moving on to the next startup again that was just started. And I walked in, there was no infrastructure, and doing that again, right? And going, okay, so we're gonna build it while it's open, while we're trying to make money, while we're trying to support the staff, while we're trying to write policy and procedure. And found so many of the things that I had done at Mariposa applied. Because at first I was like, I don't know if this is gonna work. And then found that, in fact, it's not different. The end goal of the construction company in our policy on customer interaction was framed at being on a job site versus being in a store. But besides that, the characteristics of how we want to care for our staff and how we want to care for the customer and how we want to be safe and how, you know, those things don't change, right? So really starting to, at that point, go, okay, I do have a playbook. I do have things that I can fall back on. I do, sometimes we also remind ourselves, I do know something. Right? Like, we can all be in a circumstance where we feel like, I don't know if I know things, because we can be in such a tight space that we can't step back and reflect on what we do know and what we do bring with us. And was at that space until the beginning of the pandemic. And then that ended, and had the opportunity to stop again. And the main difference between those two organizations, both startup phase to very actively profitable companies, which I participated in. I was not the sole participant in making it profitable, but was able to say, I know the ways in which I was able to contribute to these organizations growing, changing, being more successful, right? But also going, what are the pieces that I didn't like, that I didn't feel were, comfortable is the wrong word, that were not reinforcing my ability to be showing up as myself, to be in a good mental and emotional state, to be able to show up and do the work in a leadership role that requires a lot of you, right? Each of us who do anything in the leadership space, board members, everybody, that we need to be present, and we need to be on, and we need to be ready to engage. And that takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of resource. So in having some space to step back and go, well, what place gave me more opportunity to do that? And what direction do I want to move in? And then Dave Olson called me. He's been bugging me for a while. And then finally, I wasn't in the construction company anymore, and I was like, all right, Dave, we can have a conversation. And just hearing about the amount of turnover that had been happening with general managers in the club industry, and the number of startups seeking GMs, which led to conversations with a couple of different folks. And then I spoke with the folks at Aspet, and there was a lot of alignment in how I was wanting to show up and what they were needing, and a lot of alignment with the immediate work I had just done. They're like, we're going to build a store. And I was like, hey, I used to build shit. I just started. And so there was alignment in that, and there was the recognition and the acknowledgement that I would need certain things in order to show up. And I don't think they're crazy things. It was, I'll need a stipend to move, because I'm moving from Philadelphia up to Boston. And I want to live not in the town that we're opening the co-op, because my partner wants to be able to go and have a beer with me and not have people recognize me. And that's the thing, it was startup, especially in a smaller town, or even in a large city. In Philadelphia, the same thing would happen. Anywhere we went in West Philadelphia, it was like, hey Sam, I don't know who they are. Just a shopper that knew who I was from the co-op 5 years before, still knew who I was, and would still go, hey. My partner's like, who is that? And I was like, I don't know. So, you know, and one of the pieces that the board and I had conversation about, and one of their original goals had been to hire somebody from the community, right? Because I think we all have the idea that the only person who can understand our community is somebody in our community. And that is true, and also it's possible to bring somebody in from elsewhere and do the hard work of learning the community we're in. And it's been a lot of work, it's meant a lot of conversations, right? But that piece, and them willing to extend themselves and bring me in from a multitude of different circumstances. Coming from a co-op that is in a dense urban setting, where there's a trolley stop across the street, no parking except for metered street parking, and you just had to walk in. There was nowhere to put your cart, you left the cart inside, and then looking at a co-op opening in a suburban area in a town of 11,000 people with a parking lot, and no one's going to walk in. They're all going to drive there, right? So there's a lot of factors that are very different, and us having to talk about the fact, like, will this work? Will I bring what's needed to make this co-op successful with you all? And throughout that all, we discussed it and we considered it, and we said, yes, we think this is worth that risk, right? So there's a lot of risk in the process of you all seeking out a candidate and extending an offer. It's a lot of risk for whoever's coming in to do the work, right? part should be kept, in my perspective, at the forefront. That whoever you ask to come in to manage this co-op and work with you in the community is putting themselves at a lot of risk. They're coming into a startup. There are no guarantees in startups. And we're doing startups in the pandemic. There are no guarantees in startups and pandemics, right? It's like a new playbook that's being created, and they're like adding pages every day, like, oh, remember to do this, and don't do that anymore. And so there's, you know, kind of keeping that piece in mind. And let me see what I have next on my slides, because now we can actually one of the things that made it quite possible for how work is going at Assabet was how prepared the board was prior to my arrival, my physical, digital, whatever, arrival. And the preparation work, and if you attended Siobhan's session before mine, she was the board chair for many years. We like to joke that she's been part of the startup for like 50 years. We've only been organizing for 10. But the amount of work and the amount of time and money, because it's those things, right? It's a lot of commitment that Siobhan and the different variations of the board over the years did allowed the board to be prepared as much as they could be, because it's never perfect, for when I showed up. And they had worked with JQ and FCI, and they had worked with Coordinate, and they had worked with and had conversations with folks at NCG, and had as much of an idea as they thought they could to think about what they needed to be prepared for. And it didn't match reality. We had things that we still had to work through. There's no perfect version of how you can onboard a GM, right? And there's no perfect version of how your GM can show up and do the work. It takes a lot of willingness to accept change, to accept that my idea is not the only idea. It's a lot of the compromise conversations that are some of the most difficult, because we all like coming into a new space. I hope what I brought was an openness to just understand the community. The board and the ownership was like, we already know who we are. We got this. And I was like, I don't know. Because like what I hear, like a lot of people don't know who you are, but we already think we do, right? We think that a lot of people know who we are. As a startup, so many people in the community have already become owners, right? If you have like 800 owners and you're thinking about capital and then getting a site, you're like 800 people know who we are. How many more people in your community don't know who you are, right? And that's a lot of the work that your GM is having to do when they come in, is to be the face and to push that forward and to take the brunt of the community interaction. It doesn't take the board's role out of it, but no matter what you do, your GM gets put in that spot. You're on the news, your face is on the website, your face is on Facebook, and it's on this, and it's on that. And it puts that person in a consistent position of needing to be in alignment with the board, right? Because if you're at the forefront and you're the mouthpiece, essentially, once you're in place, you need to, the organization as a whole, you should be thinking about how are you in alignment about what the GM is saying and how you're doing that. And like I said, it wasn't perfect, but what Siobhan and the board did was prepped this lovely spreadsheet that JQ has, and that's a great send you to JQ moment, that lays out some kind of buckets of work. And it says, you as board, before the GM arrives, you go through these buckets and make a decision on who makes decisions. And it might sound really simple. And it's not, but it's also just a starting place. It's saying this is the first round. And then when the GM comes in, you do that together. And you look at those buckets again. And then the GM should have an opportunity to say, actually, in my experience, or from what I've read in the policies, or from what, reflecting, it should come from a solid source, not just like, oh man, this sucks, I don't want it. Talking about and reflecting together about the decision-making structure, because that should be the kind of codified place that you refer back to if you're having a difference of opinion, if you're having a struggle. And it's in tandem with your policies and stuff, which we'll talk about more in a minute. But it was a tool I hadn't seen before. It wasn't something that existed 7 years ago. when I was in the co-op space. There were versions of it that people were working on, and I'm sure we have different versions in different Excel sheets that live all over the place. But it was so useful because we were able to put a timeline in it that said, when I arrived, the board didn't just take the whole bucket of stuff and throw it in my lap, right? Because that's one way of doing it. Oh, thank God you arrived, here you go. Here's all the things. Here's the member list, here's the social media, here's all the stuff. You take it, it's yours. And the board takes a big sigh of relief and it's like, oh, we're done. But you're not, right? There's this diagram of overlap in that person taking things on and also saying no, right? Acknowledging that your GM should be able to have the autonomy to say, this is not where my time is best spent. Do we have a volunteer who can come in and do this? Can someone on the board continue this work? And transitioning appropriate authority over to the GM, right? And so we worked through that model. We spent, mostly Siobhan and I, because she has so much of the institutional knowledge from the organization, we spent 3 months just going through paperwork, organizing things. I went through the financials and I said, great, do you have it in the tool? It's not in the tool. We're going to put it in the tool, right? Set it all up in QuickBooks, reconcile our books, do this stuff. And those 3 months, and then the following months, didn't just bring alignment in my taking on the information, right? Because it's also this big, like, I need to be a sponge. I am a sponge, taking all this information. It was a massive trust building exercise, right? Because during that period of time, it was the most visible amount of work and the most communication that was occurring. And the communication hasn't gone away, but it's changed over time. And those months really helped to solidify and show the board the skills that I said I had coming in, the trainings I said I needed, and I did, and the board responding and approving me to have the trainings that I asked for and to partner in the ways that I had requested, right? It's definitely a two-way. And it really, that trust building, I can't speak any greater to it. It's such a keystone for how the work continues after that, because the board's going to change. You're going to have rollover, you know, I don't know what board terms are across the room, but there's inevitably going to be rollover on your board. And having your general manager set up to feel empowered within the areas that the board has approved and that you've had conversation about, and for the board to continue to fulfill the work that they need to do, that give and take, to me, is invaluable. And it's going to be different with every single one of you that hires a GM. My experience with my board is not going to be replicated exactly in any different organization, right? Because I shared a little bit about my work background, and so I'm bringing in a particular set of skills that somebody else might not be bringing in. And so you need to say, well, where are the gaps and how do we fill them and how do we train for that, right? And it's acknowledging that, again, like I'm saying this from my perspective, so it's the conversation that needs to happen with whoever you hire, is what are you bringing in? No one is perfect. No one has the full deck of cards that you want to have. And how do you fill those gaps in a trust-building way? Because I don't, in my experience, if those 3 to 6 months, as they occur, if they don't act as a trust-building exercise, that is very hard to take back for you all as a board and for the GM, right? If there is a micromanaging of your general manager, it's not going to go well. No one likes to be micromanaged, but especially when you hire a GM who theoretically knows a lot, right? And who has a lot of skills and experience to bringing in, and then the board second guesses everything they do, right? That is not trust building, and that's going to create friction that you may never really get past until possibly the whole board has cycled out. And that could take 5 years, right? In theory, 7, 10, I don't know how long the terms are. So this piece in the kind of preparation for the amount of fluidity and willingness to change and kind of expand on how you think this process goes is really vital. And I'd love to just kind of hear thoughts and questions about this topic, because I mean, we could just stay here. we don't have to go to other slides, but I'd like to hear some of your thoughts or questions you might be having about where you fall within this range of preparation, where you feel your gaps are, if you have questions, because this area is one of the areas where I feel like there is the most strength of resource, or it's one of the areas where there's a lot of resource that's, if not wasn't present before, is now present within the consulting world. So questions?
So when you came on board,
Yes.
did Assabet already have all their policies and procedures in place, or did you help write them?
No, that's a great question.
Together?
So the board had already written and approved policy governance.
Okay.
And I had that at the end, but we could easily talk about that right now. No matter what your style of governance is, because it doesn't have to be policy governance, but if it's not written and codified, right, that is hard, because that set of documents should guide how you interact. It should guide, even more than that rubric, right? It's more legally binding for your GM as a staff person of the co-op. I would recommend it purely from a legal standpoint. Your directors and officers insurance, right? Right? Everybody have directors and officers, okay? Because you need to have that to be protected as a group of people that is in the bylaws accountable for the co-op, right? And the policies are this great gray area around legal things that should protect the board and the staff from getting close to the things that become a legal issue, right? So your governing policies, that was the first, I think before I even was willing to accept the position, I signed an NDA, I asked for a copy of the financials, I asked for the policies, I asked for the bylaws, because to me, knowing that those were there, prepared, set up, properly written, and that the funding work was at least underway, and that it was being done in the correct way, those were really important factors for me accepting the job. Now, if policy governance itself had not been in place yet, I wouldn't have refused the job, but I would have needed to know that the work was significantly underway to have a governing model. Because I know there are some folks that don't consider policy governance the way they want to govern as a board, and that's totally fine. But whatever model you have should represent the relationship that the board has with the GM, that the board has with the staff. And I say that kind of facetiously because it really should just be the board and the GM. And that should stop there, right? But within that structure, it should be laid out. How do we communicate? How do we, you know, I've dealt with boards in the past. I've sat on boards. I'm coming in with more experience in working with the board than some folks might. And so what I know, which I would hope that you all would share with the incoming GM, is that their ability to understand those policies is probably one of the most vital things they can do when they first come in. Because you can learn tools, right? You can learn how to use QuickBooks, you can learn how to use the point of sale system, you can learn the member database. Those are tools. There are endless amounts of Googling you can do to learn those tools. The policies, the bylaws, the governing documents for the co-op. I've talked with other GMs who've just come into their co-op and don't have board experience. And if they don't know the policies, it is a struggle to have an appropriate and kind of eye-to-eye conversation about the governance and how you're treated as a general manager, right? It's a very good resource to fall back on. Hey, the communication's not happening the way that feels comfortable to me. I'm going to go to the policies, I'm going to look at the linkage policy between board and GM, and I go, oh yeah, you shouldn't be texting me. It's not, no. You're a board member who was given no authority by the rest of the board to communicate with me, and so I need to have something that the board has authorized to say no. because it's very difficult to do. As an incoming general manager, you're building trust, you're doing this stuff, and you want to say yes to pretty much, you want to say yes to a lot of stuff, right? You feel often pushed in the direction of saying, I will say yes because it seems like what everybody wants. But as a general manager, you should be able to say no because of X, Y, and Z. There should be data. I mean, and that's the thing, it's like trust and verify, right? So if your GM says no, it's totally appropriate to say, and why, right? But that again should come from the whole board. And I've had the experience of getting individual emails of and why. And it's not that I don't want to have individual conversations with people, but what if another board member is asking the same question and didn't send it, right? So how do we create a way that we can communicate an appropriate open conversation? Have a board list. You have a board list that your GM is on. It's a Google group. It's really simple, or it's an Outlook group, or whatever version of email you use. But how do you create that open conversation space, right? And this is just like one piece. I'm just talking about one bit of how the policies can impact. But that one piece, for me personally, is huge. Again, how can I show up in this space and feel prepared means I don't have individual conversations with all the board members all the time. Because what ends up happening is that I get 10 different opinions, and I get 10 different perspectives, and I get 10 different sets of emotions, and I'm managing that again and again and again. It takes up a lot of my time. My time should be spent on board work, part of my time, but if I can work well with our board chair, and then work well with the board as a whole, those are my two directives that I'm really working on. And if I have a policy that reinforces that place and that position that I'm coming from to say no, like, I really appreciate that you asked this question. And this is exactly what I've done in the past. I really appreciate you asked this question, and I'm responding to the whole board list with your question. That's it. It's not a shaming exercise, it's nothing else, you know, it's just, this is, if it's going to be a conversation, it's among the whole group, right? And building that trust and knowing if somebody on the board is volunteering for work, there's also a distinction there. And I will have a conversation with that person separately about the work that they're doing, right? If you're a graphic designer and you're volunteering to do graphics work, yes, we will talk about the flyer that needs to happen, right? But we're not discussing the inner workings of the board. And we're not having a governing conversation, right? Because again, that should happen in the board space. And if it ever gets a little uncomfortable, I can go back to the policy and just point that out. It usually is a pretty calm way, just bringing it back. And my way of reminding where we should be appropriately in the communication space and the leadership space. So I don't know if that was useful or, but
fine, thank you.
Yeah, it was definitely there in place, and it's been very useful that that was in place prior to my hire. Other thoughts, questions? You want to move on?
I want to just mention that if you don't have the policies in place,
yeah,
or you do have them, because that was one of the bad things about P6ing. We P6'd the policies without a total understanding of what implications they are, and then when we found a general manager, we went back and said, wait a second, we took training on it and everything. So it's very important to do it early and understand what they are, even before your GM's hired. So
I totally agree. The board understanding the policies as well is really important, and that sometimes falls to a few folks on the board who have the capacity to take on the kind of deeper dive, or have a brain that goes into a legal space easier, because that's not how all of us function. But yeah, having that within the board, and again, like having Siobhan, who helped to codify those policies on the board still, was really valuable. She and a few others had a deeper understanding of those as well. Yeah.
If I might add, we just about had our policy register ready when we hired, and then scrambled and finished it. But then also went through a step of reviewing it with our general manager, or letting him review it, and hearing his feedback on a few things, and because he has more governance experience than all of us. And so we heard him out on a few items and made some edits. So it was a collaborative process to get to the finish line.
And if you're doing it at that point, it's easier before you've made the final decision, right? Because then you don't have to go back and then tell everybody that you changed the policies and do the whole thing over again. It's worth doing if there's critique that's worthwhile, right?
Right.
But if you're at that point, that's a really valuable step. I saw him back here.
We were given advice we're at the pre-development stage, have a site, working towards groundbreaking, and finishing up the policies and all that. How soon would you recommend hiring a GM? Would you recommend hiring them during this pre-development stage, or after, or right before we open? Like, what would you feel is the best time to be hired for a new cooperative opening?
That's a really good question. And this is kind of we were just talking about this. It's kind of in this land of like where my slides on order. Let me try one more. Yeah, it's here. They're just out of order. So this piece, I could possibly say things that might rub some folks the wrong way. But so I'm just speaking from my experience. I would say the starting place often is going to have to do with how much capital you've raised and how your performance set up. And it goes back to the piece about training and board preparation, because how well does the board as a whole understand the performa, understand the funding model, understand how that works, and how well does the general manager coming in understand it as well? Those are really important linkage points, because my instinct is to say you hire well before you've opened, if you have the funds to do it. Because as a board, I mean, no offense, as a board, maybe some folks are blessed with board members who have grocery, construction, design experience, right? My experience is that often boards are made up of very passionate folks who don't have that experience, right? Who may be very educated, have gone through, you're at this phase, right? So I think at this point, know much more than when you started, right? If you've attended these sessions, you've gone through and you've trained with folks. But when it comes to that pre-opening work and building the store and hiring the staff and writing those policies and having your logo reset or set, I would recommend, if you can afford it, to have your GM in there to do that work with you, because, like, here's a silly example. The one thing that Asabet had done before I was hired was they changed the logo a little bit, and they were told not to by folks that they talked with. They're like, oh, don't do that. Your GM's going to come in and they're going to change it, right? And that's exactly what happened. So 6 months after adding a little thing to the logo, I was hired. I was like, guys, why did you add this? The session's being recorded, so after the recording's off, I can tell you what happened. That's just a little example of a thing that there needs to be alignment, and it doesn't ever mean that the board is cut out of the decision-making picture. In my perspective, is that you want to have somebody that has some operational experience in there who's working with your consultants. So say I came in, say I didn't run a construction company, right? And I didn't have that experience. I've not been a project manager, don't know that. I still know about grocery. And if I'm talking with now the folks at NCG about setting up our store, even if I didn't have construction experience, I have opinions about how the inside of the store works. And I guarantee my opinions are more informed purely for the fact that I've run a store before than the folks on my board. And I know this because there was a site that fell through before I was hired that I saw the designs for, which were within what the board was working with, and there's no fault within that. But there were things that I would have definitely done differently. And if I had walked into that site already being developed, I'd been like, oh boy, like this is a lot of work to undo at this point. So it's back to the performance piece, knowing how much cash you have to spend before you open, not on the project, right? Because on that fund sources and uses page, there's the category of staff before opening, all administrative costs before opening, which is separate from your building cost, your equipment cost, pre-opening staffing, immediately before your first order. And the number you have in there, the number you can afford, is really important.
Okay.
And for Assavet, they have 2 years of my labor acknowledged in the performance. Not before, but because of the pandemic, right? So it was about a year originally, and then the site fell through and we had to find a new site, and now we had to get 5 special permits, and we had to get our building permits, and that everything has pushed things back a bit, right? But been able to acknowledge in the pro forma, all right, can we still afford me for another 6 to 8 months before revenue, right? So it comes back to that question, and my advice is find a way to afford it.
Yeah.
If you can write a grant, if you do something that would allow that to happen, because then you also can link up with organizations that are going to support you. And it's intentional that support wants to be through the GM.
And I can imagine you save money in the long run by not having to correct so many mistakes that the GM knows.
Yeah, and I think in line with that is it is this piece of it, and this is a lot of my experience. If you work in operations, if you work, maybe not having worked as a general manager, but whoever you have coming in, you would hope does have operational experience, right? And a lot of that work is taking the dreamy magic that has been the startup years, right? And turning them into reality. And that one phrase is all of the pre-open work, right? So at whatever point you insert the GM is hired. However much happened before, and then how much time you have after, is the GM is having to acknowledge all the decisions that have already been made, and maybe they were made as idealized decisions, right? I have some dreamy ideas about how I want our office to be for the staff. What I do with dreamy ideas, because I'm an operations person and I've spent 15 years going, well, that's not going to work, right? We need to afford this. How are we going to do this, right? Not saying no, but saying here's the idea of work. We need to see what we can work into our operational model that we can afford on opening and still have cash to run the store for the next 6 months if we don't have profit coming in. And so one of the things that I would like, one of my ideal things was like, I want to have a real serious place staff can relax, right? This is an unheard of thing. Most co-ops, the offices are, kind of like this room, but with desks, right? They're very tight, because we want to have as much retail space as possible, right? We want every dollar for profit, right? And so we have the opportunity with our space. We have 2,000 square feet of office. And I'm not going to have the staff to fill 2,000 square feet of office. So I was like, all right, cool things we could do would be like a lounge space for staff, and we could have a shower there, commute on their bikes. It's going to look great. And then I had the project priced, and the first thing that went out that was VE for the showers and the walls. So there's a reason that open concept spaces still happen, is because a door frame and a door is like $6,000 a piece. I was like, all right, let's just cut them all out. We'll just have a big open space, right? So those are decisions that I need to make, and if I didn't have construction experience, I should be making with a project manager, with an owner's rep, with somebody who's working with the GC, right? And I believe that whoever your GM is still should be trusted to work with those folks and make those decisions in the best way possible for the store, in the most cost-effective way for the store. But I still believe that those will be the trust and verify version of a better decision than if a volunteer board is making those decisions. It's not your full-time job, right? And it's a lot of work. And so that really should be with the person who is the full-time person doing this work, working with whoever they need to have the right understanding and resource to make wise decisions, and be allowed to do so. Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. This slide, I would love to hear more from folks on what are some of the cool ideas, what are some of the things that would need to be operationalized, because some of them are worth doing, right? The session that I was talking about earlier has to do with DEI work. which a lot of people put in that magical, idealized space. But from my perspective, you do that work. You make that happen before the store's open. It's so much easier to do that work, be prepared for that work before you open, because then you have to change so much more when the store's open and functioning, because then you're worried about the business, right? So that's one of the areas that I say it's always worth the time, it's always worth the money to prepare your space in that way. So what other things would you all think about? Like what would be your dreamy things that you're not sure of?
Well, I've been tasked with the idea that we want to make the store funky.
Yeah.
And there's truth to that, and there's value to it. But that sometimes means an internal graphic coordinator, for example. So any thoughts around that?
Yes, I have so many thoughts about that. So we have a budget that's not a big budget. It's our pre-opening marketing. And I would think about that first. So what's the budget? The budget can change. That's a conversation, right, between the board and the GM to say, we think appropriately that some of the budget should be allocated into our marketing budget, pre and post-open, that is currently allocated into a different space. But you really need to have very sound reasons for making that choice, because it's kind of an intangible, and it's assumptive of what people want in the space, unless you have surveyed every person, and they've all said funky space, right? And so I would say a balanced approach would be best. What can you afford pre-open that you can build into the project cost? Because that is, in my perspective, financially easier to do than to pay somebody a full-time position after you open. Because in my perspective, a startup that is of the size that we are, which is 6,000 retail, we can't afford them. I have to have a person who's going to be marketing, membership, and that, you know, a whole other host of things within that role that needs to manage any internal graphics with the support of NCG, outside design person. Now, what I can do, what I can control, is the designer that we're working with right now, who's local to the co-op, not within the co-op world, but within the town, and is now a co-op owner as well. We went through the process with the board of redesigning the logo, and she stuck around. It was her first experience with like a board in any capacity, and she stuck around. And basically what I worked with her to do, and we're still working on, is to build as much of a library as possible within our pre-opening budget that can be utilized by somebody who has, I would say, in the low to medium skills, that can open in design and put things together, right? Because you can do funky that way. You can do interesting. You can have some artwork in the space when you open, and then you can have work in the design on your end caps, and you can have things on your tags, your logos, your flyers, your website, Facebook, that can be coming from that library that was already built, and you're basically giving somebody just a bunch of puzzle pieces that can be fit together in a multitude of ways, right? And that would be, from my perspective, one of the best ways to afford that work, because I don't believe most startups can afford that person. So, yeah. What other dreamy things do you have?
One of the ideas that we've had from pretty early on in our organizing is the idea of tiered pricing within our store, and so that's like a really magical idea. How can people access groceries at the price at which they can, that is affordable to them, but then how do we make that work in our bottom line? How do we make it work in terms of at the cash registers and, the POS system? How do we,
that one is definitely, I would say, a resource that exists within open co-ops. And that's that share and share alike, or P6, whichever version you want to use. But there are folks that have food for all programs that are functional and actively work and don't impact the bottom line. And I think if the desire is to have a program that works, because one of the things that I caution against is to do an ideas program that fails, because the impact of a failed program in an open co-op is so much harder to take back than to wait and to do it well 6 months later, right? And so for the version of the Food for All program that we've been talking about, which is active among New England co-ops and other co-ops across the country, is to have a member loan fund that for folks who are socioeconomically struggling, they access that loan fund. And they're loaned $175 towards a $200 equity, and the $25 is what they can contribute, but they can do that in $5 increments over a period of time, right? What does that do? It allows them ownership. They can vote, they can sit on the board, right? And I think that level of empowerment, to me, is so important. But it also has an at the register effect. There's also 10% off for folks who are in that program at the register, so they're experiencing a different price at the register immediately. So it's not exactly a tiered program, maybe the way I heard you frame it, but it does allow folks to experience prices differently. So this is not the only way to do it. But from I'm not risk averse in any way, but from my experience with applying a theory to a program, utilizing a model that has been tinkered with and worked on and is shown functional is often a good place to start with. Because we're also thinking about what is that actual cost, right? So 10% off at the register. As we're doing fundraising work right now, I have to quantify that to folks that we write grants to. They're like, what is that number? I'm like, I have calculated out $500,000 as the 10% at the register spread over 2 years for certain grants, right? So that's saying we can afford $250,000 a year through this program. It's a made-up number because we don't know how many folks will actually utilize the program. It's assumptive of a certain number of people joining the program, utilizing it, and then calculating the cost at the register for that 10%, right? And so even if you don't go with a program like that, be able to calculate the cost. Because I've participated in, at Mariposa for a while, there was just a member discount. And when it came to budgeting for the next year, that was, you can't. That's saying, I know every single one of you are going to shop a certain amount, and that's how much we're taking away from the bottom line. And that's why a lot of folks go and do dividends, right? It's predictable. We can predict better the dividends. But then people aren't experiencing the in-store shopping the same way. So that's where you have like a member day. You have coupons. You have different ways we can build it into the pricing and the model. So it's not a simple answer. But my suggestion is you talk with folks with open co-ops who are experiencing currently different pricing levels, and how is that working for them? Because when your store opens, you have to do a couple of things well to set the tone for the community. You need to do things like have product on the shelves, have the prices right, have the food stocked on a regular basis, have received on a regular basis. I'm just listing out like the basic tasks of running a grocery store, you know, and we have to do those things really well. And so for a lot of us, if we want to do more, which we want to do more at Assabet, and so we're thinking like, how do we afford to do more? For us, that means fundraising. That means how do we afford maybe other staff to support this work, other programming to support this work, but it's not built into our business model. It's not affordable, right? Because we're in one of the lowest profit industries that has further slashed its profits as a co-op, right? As co-ops, we have a lower bottom line than a standard grocery store does. So it's a complicated piece that is worth working on, right? Because making the store affordable for people should always be what we're trying to achieve. We're going to try to be WIC applicable. And so that's a conversation piece that I've been very openly talking about with our ownership for the last year and a half. Every session, guess what we're going to carry? We're going to carry products that I guarantee a lot of folks will hate, right? Similac, Coke, Wonder Bread. Just naming some brand names that often have a virulent effect. If we were to put them out on a table at an owners meeting and say, we're going to carry these things, what? Because then it's more than the equity of the company that produces the item. It's the equity of the person coming in the front door, and allowing them access to the store. This is my perspective, this is my board's perspective, and our owner's perspective. It's not everybody's, right? So this isn't necessarily how everyone's going to function. But for us, I can't judge how people eat. That's not what I'm here for. And if our ownership has said that that's not what they're there for either, then we're going to try to achieve that goal of finding ways that we can be affordable to folks on opening. So having the SNAP program, being WIC applicable, participating in NCG and having co-op basics and co-op deals, and all of these ways that we can lower the immediate price on the shelf, and then do the research to see if you can afford a tiered program or a food for all program or something like that. So it's a multitude of ways to really think about it. And there's some awesome folks at NCG that do a lot of thinking about this. So, yeah. I keep pointing at Dave, just he has an NCG mascot. Yeah. So I don't know if that was helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other folks? Any ideals? Any magic that you want to see happen? And you're curious about? I'm not the arbiter of viability either. Just speaking from my experience. But any other ideas? Yeah.
So for a long time, people were talking about having a community room or space that people can gather, and I think we will have some tables and things like that. But what I've been hearing recently is for every square foot you give to that, you don't sell any product.
Yes.
And so you can never even make up through like renting that space, the stuff you do. Anyway, so I think it's going to come to a point where you're going to disappoint some of the members because you've been talking about that for so long, and not really, because we're just not, I don't see how we're going to have the space. So it was a messaging thing, but yeah, I'm not sure how that's going to work.
I would say think laterally. You don't have to have community space in your store.
Yeah.
You can have community space though. Like what organizations are in the town that you're trying to open the co-op in? And,
Oh, yeah,
you know,
yeah.
so we have an organization in the town of Maynard. It's called Open Table. They're a food pantry of a very efficient order. Their project is very well done, and it's because of COVID. It's one of those kind of crazy moments where you're like, their work had to become more efficient, just like a lot of stores, right? Because of COVID, they had to put everything online, and they had to figure out how people could do remote checkout and how can they do. And this was an organization that we hadn't had a close relationship with prior, just there's a little bit of dissonance. We had some owners that would show up at their events and tell them how to do stuff with food, and that's not a good idea. So one of my goals was set meeting with the executive director for that organization and just have a conversation, right? And actually see what she actually thought of the co-op, what her perceptions, misconceptions were of the co-op. And then how do we partner? What can we do together? And so I came with a list. I came with a wish list of what I wanted to do with them. Knowing the work that they do, knowing the reputation they have within the community, it's a positive one. They're not exclusionary. They're very welcoming. And it took us about 5 months to actually schedule a meeting because we're both too busy. So we were always like, okay, I'm available Tuesday at 2. I don't know, I'm out of town, you know. So we finally got to sit down at the beginning of this year. So all told, it was a year from when I started till I actually could sit down with this person. But I'd had this idea, which was the same problem of we won't have space. We'll have a cafe, and we could do a modified bit of a meeting space in there, but 30 people, right? It's not huge. And so we finally sat down, and we had a great conversation. I was able to demystify what we're doing with the co-op. It's not a Ponzi scheme. It's not, you know, like those things that kind of get brought up. And then to talk about what our goals were and how to partner with this community work, not be dissonant and separate and trying to do our own food pantry or something like that. And we have a great relationship now. We have like a standing lunch where we catch up. And the thing that we're working to do is that they have a full commercial kitchen as well. And they have space. And they haven't been doing anything in it except for the food production for the exterior pickup. And I was like, could we, and then I started going through my wish list. Could we host cooking on a budget classes in here? Could we host community meals? could we partner with you on all this stuff, right? And the answer was like, yes, 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 yes. And so there are other spaces like that that we can reach out and have resource with. There's some awesome art spaces that have huge auditoriums. There's a church that's refurbished and is now an event space that now gives us free space whenever we need it, because they open the bar and people like to get drinks. But I like to say, just think laterally. It doesn't have to happen in your store. It's still you, right? Because we aren't just the physical location, we are the community. So how do we also invite other businesses in to participate with us in this? And across the board, people have been like, oh my God, I didn't know you guys were so cool. Right? It's also another way for people to know who we are. And these were folks that are in the literal little 11,000 person town. They should have already known. But again, it reiterates the point that like, not everybody knows who we are. Not everyone knows what we do or how we do it, right? So it's a lot of relationship building. But I don't think you need to try to afford it in your store. It's worth finding the space and doing that community work. But just partner. Yeah. There are other folks who are doing this.
Yeah. Okay.
So, kind of piggybacking on that, I'm sorry. So Lorne is your outreach
Yes,
person?
he is. Yeah.
So is he helping you do that kind of stuff? I'm always curious about how the outreach pre-co-op kind of translates into outreach post-co-op.
Yeah.
Just kind of
Well, and so that's a good point. So I might step back from that.
Okay.
So one of the things that was a discussion point with myself and the board immediately when I started was, are you keeping Lorne? And I said, hell yes. But again, if we can afford it, right? It is that can we afford it question. And one of the ways in my mind that I say we need to afford it is because he is essential to our continued owner growth. Like, I hope that people like me. I like talking with community, but that's not my full-time job. My full-time job is getting the store, getting the site, developing, working with the construction, getting permits, building, I have a lot of other jobs. And that piece, I've seen not always fulfilled well. Because in that rush to get the store open, and that rush to do that work, if you don't keep people engaged, who's going to show up on opening day and go, we're here for it. Oh, we didn't engage with you for the last year though, so sorry. So that was my decision, was to keep him on. And the shift that's happened is that we have strategy behind our marketing now that wasn't as fulfilled as it is now. It's not a huge 50-page marketing plan, but we have specific goals within the community and who we want to reach and how we want to message that he's able to fulfill in a much more targeted way now. And then when it comes to events and community work, it's a partnership. Mostly in the practical, the world that we live in, if me with my title asks for something, I get it more often than he does. If the director of communications and outreach calls someone and says, can we get food for the event? Yes, yes, yes. He has managed to get so much sponsored for us, it's amazing. And he has those deep connections with vendors in the community and things like that. That is a massive asset, and he is able to continue to draw on those connections. When it comes to partnerships that are of an official nature, the board has authorized me to develop those partnerships and to make those decisions. And I consider that a part of my work right now, to actually go and have those meetings and to set that up, because he would also give me feedback at times that he can have a conversation, but he's not authorized to make a final decision on some of this stuff. And then it can feel like we've extended the conversation multiple times, right? So whenever it's sometimes a feelings moment. If it feels like somebody that he knows well and can have a good conversation with, that's great. But I also kind of want to disabuse people of what notions they might have of the GM and whatever, in quotes, you want to fill that with. So I like to have those meetings and I like to set up those relationships. I found most of the time they've been extremely useful because I can speak to the details of the project in a way that he doesn't know the construction as much, right? Or he doesn't know the governance piece as much. And I've managed to go through the conversations and find out almost every time that people hold some idea about what we do it's not the reality of what we're doing, and it's been a useful tool in telling them more about who we are, what we intend to do, and how we'd like to work together in the future. So I find that in my role, I'm able to kind of pull those pieces together. That might not be the same within every community, but for the work we're doing and how we're doing it, that's working really well for us right now.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Is that outreach after the GM? Does that function as a board for you, or is that a paid position for you guys?
Outreach is a paid individual for us. There are going to be times where that's not possible, and then I would say that one of the things that I've actively worked on and for a while had Lauren working with a group of volunteers to support that work, because capacity, right? So we had a couple of meetings, and then because it is his work, the committee was really his to manage after that. But what we did is had meetings around standards, structure, and I have like a line that we'd write this up as standards for those doing communication work. If it's something that falls below this line, you can't post about it, you can't talk about it. If somebody asks a question on Facebook, you can't respond to it. Do not pass go, do not collect $200, send it to Sam. And that's stuff around, when are we opening? Tell us the details. Like, there's certain categories of things that the board and I have agreed on that we're not speaking about publicly right now. So those things are clear standards for that committee. And if you didn't have a staff person doing all of that work with them, those standards are even more important. And that committee should still be accountable to and working with the GM, not the board. That is my opinion, it's not everybody's opinion. But if marketing falls under, if we go back to that kind of, for me, the policy governance style of things, and if you've gone through that checklist and you've decided who's the decision maker, there's also the piece that's, it might be that certain decisions are still with the board, the work is still with operations, it's still with staff. And so when there are committees formed for operational purposes, the agreement that the board and I have come to is that operational committees don't report to the board, they report to me. My role is to report on those things to the board in my monthly reports, right? And so figuring out that structure, figuring out that dynamic is important, but you write it down and you make sure it can be one page, but that committee needs to have structure and accountability, and that accountability should be to the GM until you have a GM, that's the board, right? But, and then once you have a GM, it should be handed to them. So volunteers and volunteer committees have been a great resource that I've experienced both with the pre-open and open co-op, right? There's still folks that really actively want to participate in this work and that have a lot of skills and experience they can bring. Yeah. Any other things? I think we're rolling in close to time here. Yeah, we've got 5 minutes. Any last pieces, questions, thoughts? Nothing? Excellent. Oh, yes.
Well, I just wanted to comment and say that some of the things that you mentioned and people here must have given me some ideas of what I'd like to see going on in our store. For instance, we have a 72-hour sale on the weekend, and our store manager came up with that. And to enhance it more and to encourage our members more, because we need more of our members to shop. Included in the 72-hour sale, we could add a coupon for the next week for just the members only to use. And so that gave me that idea.
Yeah, and it's being, I think, when it comes to specials and discounts, they can get out of hand really fast. Really fast. And it's unpredictable cost. So it's making it predictable, and it's acknowledging your marketing budget that you're spending that money, or it's acknowledging it in your category of your sales and then your cost of goods and how much, like, if it's a coupon, you get that money back, right? If you have that thing to redeem that's for jovial pasta or something like that, you send that coupon and it gets redeemed, you get a check, right? So that's money out temporarily, money back in. If you're doing a special in store that you're taking the cost on, you have to acknowledge that cost.
Right.
And that's the piece that if you're doing that and you want to try a few things out, make sure that you have the structure in place to report back on it so you can acknowledge the cost and reflect and say, we've tried this for a quarter. right? Because if we try something for 2 weeks, it's not going to catch on. So if you're going to commit to something, you should try it for a period of time that is like repeatable and reportable. So you have at least 3 months. You can reflect the trend and say, did this work? How much did it cost us? And maybe the cost was a little bit more than you wanted. Maybe it brought in a bunch of new shoppers, and now you have your shopping base.
That's what it's doing, bringing in
So
new
it's
shoppers.
exactly that. So it might be worth the cost then if you're doing it. But acknowledge that cost and calculate it, and then see if that's, maybe you tweak it and say 72 hours is too much. Maybe we do 24 hours, right? And modify it or do, but it absolutely think about how that, the impact on in different areas, and we have to be strategic in those things. Yeah. That's a great idea. Yeah. Thank you all so much. This is a great
Thank you.